Good morning, everyone. It is so good to be with you. I've been looking forward to this for some time now. It is an honor for me to be a member of the faculty at Brooks. I really enjoy serving our students, covering different topics, and definitely, as Dr. Thurman suggested, anything that they need me to teach, I'll teach. So if you haven't taken a course at Brooks before, I really hope that you'll do so. We have a great privilege of growing and learning together. We have a wonderful faculty. We have a wonderful administration. It's an honor for me to be a part of. I've been a part of a lot of different institutions over the decades of my ministry, especially teaching ministry. And maybe we just haven't hit rough roads yet, but the faculty, the staff at Brooks has been so wonderful, both to me and to one another. I've not seen a faculty that's not that is this non-dysfunctional. And for someone who's been in education for so long, probably longer than I deserve, it's a wonderful privilege. So again, I hope that you will take advantage of the opportunity to take a course at Brooks. And by the way, and maybe I'm saying this too early, but I want to put in a quick plug before I forget. For a course that we're going to teach in the fall, actually I will be the one. So I and the mouse in my pocket, right? So we'll be teaching a course, Egypt in Biblical History. Do you know about that? Some of you do. First time ever taught. So here's, added to the list of the courses I've taught. First time I will ever have taught this course, this specific course. I've taught an ancient Egypt course before. That was while I was a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, and I taught a course there for one of our satellite campuses on ancient Egypt. So it was 43 students, all of whom were unbelievers. And I taught on ancient Egypt. And I slipped a little of the connections between Egypt and the Bible in there in ways that I couldn't get in trouble, right? So I found ways. So if you want to take a wonderful course, it's going to start in August. I believe it's the 3rd of August, if I'm not mistaken, on Thursday afternoons. We would love to have you be a part of that course, whether you're taking it as an auditor or a credit student. And of course, as an auditor, it's much cheaper, and you don't have to do the tests, right? There's no final exam. There's no research paper to write. So it's a lot easier on you and your pocketbook. So if you're interested, see our Brooks representatives. And I'll just mention, too, since we've been talking about Genesis, I do hope that you, if you haven't already, and I also noticed that not everybody here has seen Is Genesis History. If you haven't seen this film, you have to see it. And I'm not just saying it because I was in it. I'm near the end of the film, right? I'm the Babylon guy. Where is the Tower of Babel? That's my part in the film. But they bring together whatever the number is, 10 or 12 PhDs from all over the world, and talking about different topics, all different fields. And in every one of those fields, you have experts who are introducing you to areas of verification and validation that push us to accepting this thing that we as Christians believe by faith, that the Word of God is not only inspired, but it's historically accurate. That's huge, very important, okay? And I'll talk about that more in a minute. So please see that film if you haven't. You will be edified. You will be amazed. I've seen it probably 15 times. Every single time I watch it, I learn something new that I hadn't noticed before. But today my topic is the invention of the alphabet. Where does the alphabet come from? It's not the first script in history. I would call it, right or wrong, the third script that came along chronologically, the first being cuneiform in Mesopotamia, especially in southern Mesopotamia, in the land of Shumer. Second script being hieroglyphics. Now we have hieroglyphic or Luwian script, which is from what you know of today as Turkey. So there's a hieroglyphic script from there. It comes a little bit later, but the Second script, the first hieroglyphic script, comes through Egypt. So we have Egyptian hieroglyphics, and that's the area of the first minor of my PhD at the University of Toronto. Oddly enough, the hieroglyphic Egyptian script becomes, if you will, the parent script. If I can use it, I'll use it loosely. I'm making that term up. It's the parent script for the alphabet. The alphabet, when it's invented, is a pictographic script. What that means, of course, is it has pictures. When you look at English writing today, and of course our script borrows from Latin. We have a variation of the Latin script, and you can see it up here over my head. That all makes sense to you, doesn't it? Now look at the letters. What connection in life or reality do you have with any one of those letters? None, right? None. They're all abstract. As children, we are taught, if we have English as our first language, we're taught to learn these abstract signs or symbols or whatever term you want to use for our letters, and we, by memory, it's impressed upon our brains that the vertical stroke and the horizontal stroke that goes at the top of it, and it's the vertical stroke then is in the middle, that is a T, and it makes the T sound typically, right? That's not how the original alphabet formed. It wasn't abstract. It was concrete. There were pictures. Nobody among scholars would disagree that that's true, I don't think. And it goes back to the 19th century BC. Well, what is the language behind the world's first script? And of course, you probably know, I'm telling you, I told the world in my publication in 2016 that it's Hebrew. I wasn't the first person to suggest that. The first person I know of who suggested that in print form, in publication, was a German scholar named Hubert Grimme. And in my first book, I devoted it to him because it's his work that I followed up on. That was published in 1923. And by the way, incidentally, and I can relate to this, trust me, he was mocked, he was criticized, and he was more or less chased out of the academy for making that suggestion. Belittled, humiliated in every way possible. I've experienced the exact same thing. I don't know what measure compared to him, but there's a price to pay. If you're going to suggest that what's taught in universities around the world about the history of something, and in this case the alphabet, is different, when you suggest that it's different than what is being taught in colleges and universities by full professors. So, let's look at this kind of piece by piece. So the publicizing and the disseminating of the research, and this all began in 2012 when I stumbled on evidence for Israelites in Egypt during the period that we know of as the sojourn. I didn't go looking for this. I literally stumbled upon it. And God just kept opening up new and different discoveries. I often compare it to going on a rainbow and you get to the end of it and there's this pot of gold. And so it's just one pot of gold after another in discovery that I never expected that God would use me to be the vessel to entrust this to. I mean, I consider myself the least of all the saints and the chief of sinners. The very terms Paul used of himself. I would suggest to you, I'm the least deserving person in the kingdom of God to entrust this to. The least. But here I am. To show that it's truly of God. That in our day, for the first time in over 1,450 years, The stories we read about with the Israelites in Egypt, we now know that they are true. They're true. We'll talk about that more this afternoon. So, the publicizing and disseminating of the research. So 2016 is when my book came out. It's called The World's Oldest Alphabet. There's been 3 printings. The first 2 sold out. The third. Now you can only buy a new copy of this, as far as I know, from the publisher itself, which is Carta in Jerusalem. There's information about this on a piece of paper that's on the table where my books are in the back, not this book. With every printing, I bought 100 copies of my own and sold them to people. And my wife kind of chastised me because the first printing, I did it at cost, right? I didn't make anything off of it because the publisher priced it high enough that I thought, well, I don't want to make people pay any more. But anyway, so 2016 is when The World's Oldest Alphabet came out. And of course, everything hit the fan when this happened. I lost a lot of friends, fellow students, PhD graduates. At this time, I had just graduated from University of Toronto. They stopped communicating with me. I wasn't invited to conferences anymore like I had been, all because I published this book. That's how serious people take this. So, then God found ways to get my research into the mainstream, into the public. One of them was through the publication of the book. Another was through a man named Tim Mahoney. First film that he put out on Patterns of Evidence focused on the Exodus. I couldn't be a part of this film because I was still in my PhD program. And if I were to go public with my views, I literally would not have passed my PhD. I now know this to be true. So he put out this movie, Tim Mahoney did, on the Exodus. And then while he was preparing for his second film was going to be about Sinai. That's when my book came out. He found out about it. And he contacted me and he said, I want to talk more. So he flew me up to Minnesota. I spent several days with him. He ended up taping me. And from that, he literally changed the content of his second film. From Sinai to Moses and the historicity of Moses and, what was the script that Moses wrote in and, all of the related matters. So the Moses controversy film spawned from his awareness of my first book. So that came out in 2019, and that helped get the word out on my book. Then, and I like to refer to my first book, The World's Oldest Alphabet, as, I don't know if any of you are hunters. I'm not really. I don't own a gun. I've shot a gun a few times in my life. I don't know much about guns. But that first book is like a sniper rifle shot because it's zooming in on one specific aspect of this wealth of evidence for Israelites in Egypt during the sojourn. But then for my second book, I followed up the first book by giving that, and I'll compare this to a shotgun shot, right? This gives you kind of a wide span of a target. You have buckshot hitting an area. So all of the evidence I present in this book, and this book finishes the job, essentially, of what I didn't do with my first book. There are copies of this book in the back. I had shipped here 32 copies, so the first 32 of you who don't have a copy and may be interested, they sell for $40 in the back. And I'd love to sign your copy if you'd like a signed copy. So what I'll do is as soon as I leave the podium here, I'll go in the back and I'll be there to sign for you in case you'd like to get a signed copy of my Origins of the Hebrews books. And since I'll probably forget, I also brought with me in my suitcase 12 copies of my newer and newest book on Nimrod. It's called Nimrod, the Empire Builder. This is the only book written, I think, in my opinion, that really gives you an accurate portrayal of the character of Nimrod in the Bible. Speaking of the book of Genesis, he is in Genesis, right? Nimrod. Who is that guy? I try to persuade you that he is Sargon of Akkad, the world's first empire builder who built the Akkadian Empire. That's who it is. So if you're interested in that book, it's paperback, and it's only $20. So you're welcome to, again, the first 12 people can get a copy, and I'd love to sign that for you as well. All right, so now let's move on into the alphabet itself. Let's talk about the historicity of the sojourn and the Exodus. We need to build a little bit of a background here. So, why is this important, right? And you may say to me, well, Dr. P, all this is interesting that you're connecting Hebrew to the world's oldest alphabet, but and you're trying to give evidence of Israelites in Egypt during the time of the sojourn, but what's it really matter? Aha. Here's the answer to that. University professors routinely cast the events of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt and the Exodus as unhistorical or mythical. I don't know if has anyone ever been in a university or college course where that has been called into question? Several of you have. I have. It's frustrating, isn't it? One Egyptologist wrote this about these biblical stories. He said, and this is in 1997, William Ward, he said, there is not a word in a text or an archaeological artifact that lends credence to the biblical narrative as it now stands. Egypt remains silent, as it always has. In other words, Egypt isn't physically producing evidence that matches with the biblical story. So why do you even believe in the story? That's where they're pushing you to. They want to persuade you of their view that the Bible is not historically accurate, and all of those descriptions of major events between a leader of the Israelites and the Israelites themselves and the Egyptians, none of that's true. That's what we are taught in universities today. From the Egyptian viewpoint, the Old Testament narrative records a series of earth-shaking episodes that never happened. That's what's in books. That's what university professors are speaking from their lecterns. A later author boldly asserted that the Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern textual and archaeological evidence does not corroborate later biblical accounts of a sojourn and an exodus. Another author vilified those who conduct research to explore whether these events are historical. In other words, is it even fair for you or for me to say, well, I want to research this and see if this could be true? They're telling you that's not an acceptable enterprise. Isn't that amazing? What are we supposed to be about in education? Objective research to learn. Maybe it wouldn't end up being verifiable. Maybe it would end up being proven wrong, whatever the topic, right? But we have to explore it. Here's a quote from Ernst Friedrichs in 1997. He said, "Since the rise of humanism in the Renaissance and the development of modern literary and historical methods of criticism, few events have been as controversial for historians as the Exodus. The traditional approach to the historicity of the Exodus gave large weight to the assertions of the biblical narrative, even when that narrative itself provided acknowledged ambiguities." They're saying it's ambiguous, or even seeming contradictions, right? And so that's the starting point. Maybe there are contradictions between what we see in the historical record and what's in the biblical account. And if they can sow that little seed of doubt inside of you, they expect it can germinate and lead you to the conclusion that it is faulty, that it is inaccurate, that it does have contradiction to it. The challenge to explain the Exodus and to affirm its historicity has encouraged a rationalizing of biblical texts, leading to, and so now they're going to throw some mud at us. Wishful thinking or special pleading. In other words, we're going against the facts, we're going against the evidence, and we're just pushing it on people and using weak arguments in the process, right? And that's leading to special pleading. So that's what we're being told. Now, why is this important? Because I don't know how old all of you are. I'm grandfather age, so our kids and our grandkids are going to colleges and universities and being taught things like this, that important biblical stories and events are non-factual. I experienced this when I moved to Southern California in 1983, and I took my first junior college course. I had a professor in Western Civ class tell us that the stories in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 can't be true because they're two different accounts of creation, and because they're different, they're self-contradictory. So you can't trust the Bible, right? These things are being taught all the time. We have to vaccinate, if you don't mind the term, some of you may, we have to vaccinate ourselves as Christians so that we can be ready when we go out there, and especially if we send our kids and our grandkids into public schools. We have to be ready for them to counter what they're getting from their professors when it calls the Bible into question and doubt and accuses it falsely of being unhistorical. That's why this matters, okay? That's why this matters. All right, now I want to look at the chronology that's involved. Again, background to get us acquainted. So this is my suggested list of dates for important events that are in Old Testament history. Some of them, not all of them. Some of them, of course, can't be dateable, aren't dateable. You don't know, we can't know the date of certain events, but for our purposes, we're just looking at the ones in yellow. 1876 BC, according to biblical chronology, if you take the chronological passages, verses, texts in the Bible, literally, will take you back to that year. It all starts with 1 Kings 6:1, which says, to paraphrase, in the 480th year after the Exodus, that the work began on the building, the construction of the temple under Solomon. The Jews call it the first temple, right? And we know that occurred in 967 BC. That being true, we can go back then from 967 backwards in time, and that takes us to what? Well, again, 480th year, that means 479 and change. And of course, the change, pocket change, is months. So 479 years and some months before 967 is when the Exodus occurred, and that's the second date there, 1476. That is the literal date of the Exodus. Now, what's become popular over the last 75 years or so, pretty much since William Albright made it famous, the suggestion has come out that the Exodus occurred not in the 15th century BC, but in the what century BC? Not the 12th, 13th century BC. And by the way, I'm a teacher. You can take the teacher out of the classroom, but you can't take the classroom out of the teacher. So I may be asking you various questions, so don't be afraid to answer. So 1446, that's when the Exodus occurred according to biblical chronology, but a view came about. It was popularized in the Ten Commandments. How many of you have seen Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments? Wonderful film. But they put it in the wrong century. It's not Ramesses. And just because you read the word Ramses in several passages in Genesis and Exodus doesn't mean Ramses is the right place. So 1446 BC, 1 Kings 6:1 takes us there. Exodus 12, 40, and 41 takes us then 430 years back from that, because it says in that passage that it was, again, to paraphrase, from the time that the Israelites entered Egypt until the Exodus, it was 430 years to the very day. That's what the text says. Specific. So, 430 years before 1446 BC is 1876 BC. Now, I did my own research to verify with the Hebrew text, because in those chronological verses, those passages, there are what we call textual variants. There are ancient manuscripts that disagree with one another. Which one's right when they disagree? Well, it just so happens in God's providence that I did my THM, my Master of Theology thesis, on the topic of lower textual criticism. Not higher, lower. Lower criticism seeks to reestablish the correct original readings when there are ancient witnesses that disagree with one another. Wouldn't you know? God would make that one of my passions, and I would pursue that in my degree. That prepared me for the historical work. So in studying those passages, I became convinced that the literal view, based on the correct textual variants, where there's variation in the manuscripts, takes us to 1446 and 1876 BC. Then in my study in Egyptology, I was able to study the issue of chronology in ancient Egypt to see if we can come up with a similar confidence in the chronological scheme that's connected to ancient Egypt. And if we could do that, then we could potentially compare the Egyptian and the Israelite to one another and see if we can get what we call an accurate synchronization, to combine the two time-wise so with confidence we know that they occurred at that very time. Can we be certain that the Israelites were literate before the Exodus? So if the dates are right and the connection with Egypt is right, now looking at the question of the identity of the world's oldest alphabet, what's the language that's connected to it? And, you could be the devil's advocate and say to me, well, Dr. P, were the Israelites even were they writing in Hebrew at the time? Because if my suggestion is correct, that Israelites invented the alphabet in the 19th century BC, and Moses lived in the 15th century BC, the 16th and the 15th, but for our purposes, the 15th century BC. If that's right, you would think that there would be some kind of validation or proof of this in Scripture. What does the Scripture have to say? There is a precedent for pre-Exodus Hebrew writings. There are several, actually, precedents. I'll look at just a couple. One is on the high priest. The high priest is wearing writing. Exodus 28:4. Now, these are the garments that they, that is, the skilled artisans, must make, right, for the high priest. A breastplate, an apron, a robe, and long-sleeved undershirt of checkered work, and a turban, and a sash, because they must fashion sacred clothing for Aaron, your brother, and his sons, so that he may act as a priest for me. So God had this prescription of what Aaron was supposed to wear. For whatever reason, God wanted it to be very specific and precise. So they had to fashion garments. These artisans had to fashion garments at the behest of God. The plate, chapter 28, verses 12 and 36. The plate on his turban was to be engraved, reading, and here's the inscription, holy to he goes on existing. So for those of you who know Hebrew, that would be a lamed prefix plus the covenantal name for God, Yahuwah. You must take 2 onyx stones and engrave on them the names of the sons of Israel. 6 of their names on the one stone, and the names of the remaining 6 on the other stone, according to their births. So, what did this mean for the high priest and what he was going to be wearing? Let's see. I don't have my reading glasses, so I think that's the laser. Yeah. So, right here on his forehead, right here on his shoulders, here are the onyx stones. The onyx stones, black onyx stones, were to contain the inscribing of letters, Hebrew letters, to be able to write holy to he goes on existing, the covenantal name of God. And the names of that's on the forehead, and then the names of the sons of Jacob on his shoulder, to connect the high priest to all of the tribes of Israel. So if this is true, that God would instruct this of the Israelites to fashion, as part of the garments, to inscribe on onyx stones these words, then they have to have a written script, don't they? There it is. You can't get away from it. Then, and here's an onyx stone, by the way, just so you know what it looks like. Beautiful black stone. It would have been gorgeous to see, to behold the high priest. But then there's something also that goes beyond this. Deuteronomy 6:5, you probably know this, the Shema, right? The corporate writing of the Shema. Shortly after the Israelites had departed from Egypt, common Israelite people were instructed to write the words of the Shema on the doorposts of their houses and on their gates, according to Deuteronomy 6:9, implying a national literacy among the people. So here are the words of the Shema. You must love, he goes on existing, your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your energy. That's how you are to love him. So they were to take that saying and write it on the doorposts of their houses and on their gates. What does this tell us about the written script of Hebrew at the time? Did just the priests know this? No. Who else knew it? Everybody. Ancient Near Eastern scholars cannot reckon with this. They cannot reconcile it with their concept of what the ancient world was like. For them, only the scribes and the elite knew how to write. So the invention of the alphabetic script was a barrier burster. Before, and probably this was true to a large extent, that only scribes and important people in society knew how to write. Now, with the invention of this alphabet, anybody could read it, write it, or understand it. Why? Because it's a picture book. It's drawings. If you can look at a drawing and know what it's representing, you're good to go. So, that's the connection of the alphabet. That's why you can have a script this far back in history that all the people would be able to know and understand and read, because it was made to be simplistic. So yes, there was a written script according to Scripture already in place in Moses' day. Moses didn't invent the alphabet. Moses used the alphabet that was invented hundreds of years earlier. And that's what I'm going to show you. So identifying the language for the alphabet was an alphabetic script in existence then that the Israelites could have used. That's the next question that we're brought to. So I have for you 3 different inscriptions here. The one on the left, this is the oldest of the 3. In fact, this inscription is the oldest known fully alphabetic inscription. Despite what you may have read several years ago about a quote-unquote discovery made in ancient Syria by the way, not an epigrapher such as I, someone who specializes in ancient writings, but a field archaeologist made the claim that there's an alphabetic inscription in Syria that goes back even earlier in this. No, not even so. This is the oldest inscription, Sinai 377. I've seen it with my own eyes, literally, last year. I saw this inscription for the first time. It dates to around 1840 BC. You say, well, Dr. P, how do we know the date? Because literally there are only 4 letters on it. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it, 4 letters. We know because it's got a parallel inscription that was incised when it was incised. And this is all in Middle Egyptian. And right at the top here you have what we call a date formula. The renal dating of a certain king who ruled over Egypt. So it gives us the king's name, the year of the king's reign, so we know exactly what the date is. So if we can do what I talked about before, which is establish a dating scheme for Egyptian history that's reliable, we can know the exact year when this Hebrew inscription, this oldest Hebrew inscription, dates to. And there it is, 1840 BC. Who remembers what year, according to literal chronology, did the Israelites enter Egypt under Jacob? 1876. Does it fit? Fits perfectly. This is just several decades later. Fits like a glove. Second image here, this is an inscription That's from the site of Lahun, and it dates to 1831 BC. This is what I would call a quasi-bilingual inscription. So, and I refer to it as the Lahun bilingual inscription. It was published first in 1921, I believe, by William Flinders Petrie, a famous Egyptologist who was very interested in the alphabet. He discovered it at the site of Lahun, the first city where Joseph went after he was elevated to second in command over Egypt. It starts in Egyptian. It reads right to left, top line first. That is another Egyptian renal dating formula right there. This here means the renal year of, or the renal year, and then this means 10. So another one of these means 10 plus 10 is 20, and I think there are 9 vertical slashes here, so year 29. And the king is Amenemhat III. So we know that that is datable. So Egyptian, Hebrew, that is a Hebrew letter, and it ends in an Egyptian hieroglyphic. This is the Nesu glyph that refers to the king or something that is royal. So that's one of the earliest alphabetic inscriptions, the Lahun bilingual Ostracon. And then we have inscriptions in Egypt and Sinai that go all the way down to the 15th century BC. And guess what happens in the middle or so of the 15th century BC? Yeah, the Exodus occurs. No more inscriptions there. They disappear. All of these inscriptions in different places, at least 2 sites in Egypt, 2 sites in Sinai. No more. The valve closes, shuts off. Why? The Israelites are gone. They take their writing with them, and it's found elsewhere. So the study of the earliest alphabet goes back to at least the 3rd quarter of the 19th century, meaning 1875. For all of these years since, scholars have been attempting to decipher the script. Virtually all scholars agree that the oldest alphabetic inscriptions in the world were composed in a Semitic language. For example, Amorite, Akkadian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Phoenician, Edomite, and so forth. Virtually all scholars agree that the world's oldest alphabetic script was taken directly from Egyptian hieroglyphics. Egyptian hieroglyphics has over 800 signs, what we call signs. There's what's called a sign list. You have to learn these as you study Egyptian. It's really a lot of work. I mean, we have, 26 letters in our alphabet? Is that right? 26? Imagine 800 plus. That's Egyptian, and they're all pictures. So whoever invented the alphabet borrowed, and I would call it 22 from among the 800 plus signs and turned them into alphabetic letters that now represent and possess only one use. In Egyptian, there are 4, if you write a hieroglyph in Egyptian, there are 4 different ways of using a hieroglyph, depending on the specific hieroglyph and the context and everything else. It could be phonetic. It could be just for what's called a determinative, to narrow the field, to make it clearer what precisely is true of that concept that you're communicating and so forth. But with the alphabet, it was just using it to make one sound, the sound of a consonant. So the original alphabet, everybody would agree with this, consists of, it represents a phonetic sound that represents a consonant. And as I mentioned to you before, Grimet was the first one to suggest that Hebrew is the language of the first alphabet. But his work is plagued with errors. He tried to correctly connect an alphabetic letter, right, a pictographic alphabetic letter, to a sound, the b or the r or the s or the t or the l. But he got several of those wrong. So from his day until our day, and when I came into the picture, it was 2012. When I came into it, I didn't even know about this whole area of study. I had to talk to a scholar who was my dad's age to be able to catch me up on 150, almost 200 years of scholarship. So I read books and journal articles and so forth, and found out all that had been going on in this field from its inception until today, so that I could make my contribution, so that I could study in an informed way. So what is the language behind the world's oldest alphabetic inscriptions? Most people are taught what? Most people assume what? What is the language behind the first alphabet? Not Sumerian. Phoenician. That's what you typically will hear. Let me show you something that will blow your minds, okay? This is Sir Alan Gardner, British scholar who was probably the 20th century's top expert on the written language of ancient Egypt. He was a hieroglyphic expert. He said this, quote, and he said this in 1916. Until recently, Phoenician was held by most scholars to have been the actual parent whence or from where the Greek and the Sabaean, that's another ancient language, people, with their offshoots and its own ultimately spring. So, until recently, he's writing in 1916, Phoenician was held by most scholars to be the parent of all these other scripts. In other words, this is the first alphabetic script. But he's saying in his day, in 1916, that's no longer the case. They now know that Phoenician is not the origin. The problem with Phoenician being called the parent language is, one, that the oldest alphabetic inscription, which does use pictographic letters, dates to the middle of the 19th century BC. You saw it, Sinai 377. Thus predating Phoenician inscriptions by a whopping 9 centuries. So what I'm telling you is, every scholar would admit that it's the 10th or 11th century BC when we have the first Phoenician inscription showing up. It's on the Ahiram sarcophagus, if you're not familiar with that. And yet, 900 years earlier, we already have alphabetic writing. How can you say that Phoenician is the language behind the world's oldest alphabetic script? You can't. You have no evidence on your side. You have 900 years of problem, if that's your view. 2, that the oldest Phoenician inscription dates only to late in the 10th century BC, as I mentioned. And then 3, the alphabetic Ugaritic script, which does not use pictographic letters, it borrows cuneiform wedge shapes, like you see with cuneiform writing, is attested on inscriptions from the 13th century BC, thus predating Phoenician by a whopping 3 centuries. So you have an intermediary form, an alphabetic script that doesn't use alphabetic letters but uses slashes. And Phoenician comes 4 centuries after that. So how do you account for Ugaritic if you're saying Phoenician is the language behind the world's oldest alphabet? And it's not attested until the 9th century BC. And yet, 4 centuries before it, you have alphabetic writing, not even using alphabetic letters. How can you claim that Phoenician is the oldest script, is the language behind the oldest script? You can't. It doesn't work. So already 110 years ago, Gardner says that just does not work. So here is an inscription from Moses' day, Sinai 349, and this is actually my work of an epigrapher to reproduce what the letters would look like in a way that you can see it very easily. So it's a transcription. So it reads right to left, and the rows are top to bottom. Oddly enough, if you look at the inscriptions of the earliest Hebrews in Egypt and in Sinai, oddly enough, the way to read them is one of 3 options. Top to bottom, for you, left to right, or right to left. Never bottom to top. Guess where they got that from? The Egyptians. Egyptian hieroglyphics requires you to write in one of 3 ways. Top to bottom, left to right, right to left. They borrowed that same convention. It connects the writings, the inscriptions, with the parent script of hieroglyphics. So it connects the authors, the inventors of the alphabet with Egypt itself. So the center one, this is an alphabetic Ugaritic inscription. I showed you, I mentioned to you these wedge shapes. That's what they look like. And then here is an alphabetic inscription of Phoenician from about 800 BC, which if you compare it to, look for example at this. It compares to what looks like a W, a capital W here. This is a snake in 3 strokes. Really? Here's a snake making the N sound because the Hebrew word for snake is nachash, starts with a N. Therefore, when you see a snake, you think the N sound, and that's what you pronounce. And then others. So clearly, Phoenician is not the language behind the world's oldest alphabetic script. So there are 4 sites where the inscriptions were found. Lahun, we saw that Lahun bilingual inscription before. That's where Joseph moves to when he's elevated to vizier, second in command. Wadi el-Hol, which is a desert outpost of all things, that's strategically located in an area around a bend of the Nile River. So that and it's up on a hill, so you can station soldiers there to overlook a long stretch of the Nile River. It's very strategic. There are lots of inscriptions that have been left behind at this high military outpost. Included in that are 2 alphabetic inscriptions. 2 other sites. Serbit al-Khadim and Bir Nasib. Bir Nasib is where Sinai 377 is, the oldest alphabetic inscription, the one with 4 letters. And then a huge corpus of inscriptions was discovered at Serbit al-Khadim. This is a site where Egyptians would take teams to do an expedition for one purpose, to extract turquoise, so that it could be a money-generating venture. So they would go down there, no more than once a year. Some years they would not go, but they would take an annual trip or less down into Sinai from Egypt, right? And at some point from Avaris, where the Israelites were, they would take trips down into Sinai and go down and extract turquoise. So Israelites were part of these expeditions to extract the turquoise. And the corpus of inscriptions that's from Moses' day, all of these were written at the time when the Israelites were indeed slaves in Egypt. And you can see that in the meaning of the inscriptions from this time. They're extremely pessimistic, extremely sad, telling about tragic events. Sinai 349, the one I showed you before, that telling a very, very ugly and vivid story. So those are the places where they come from. Now, summary of the discovery. So my research led to the unanticipated discovery that the world's oldest alphabetic script is indeed Hebrew. After resolving the phonetic value, and that means what's the connection between what you see and the sound that it makes, the b, k, l, or s, of the disputed letters among the 22-letter alphabet, I deduced the pictographic origin of each of the original 22 Hebrew letters. I then translated 15 proto-consonantal Hebrew inscriptions that date between 1840 and 1446. Within this corpus, 3 of the inscriptions name biblical figures. 1, Osnath. Does anybody know who Osnath is? I bet there's probably not a soul who knows. Who? What? The wife of Joseph. Very good. Who got that right? Good job. The wife of Joseph. That's Osnath. There's only one person in the entire Bible named Osnath. She's the one. Her name is on an inscription. What does that tell you? Could this be Moabite? Could this be Akkadian? No. Hebrew. 2, Ahisamach. On Sinai 375, the father of Aholiab, God instructed the tabernacle to be made while they were in the desert, right? And he appointed 2 men to oversee this. One of them, his name is Aholiab. His father, that, again, a name you probably haven't seen from Adam, except on a Bible read-through, is Ahisamach. So the father of one of the master craftsmen who built the tabernacle, that father, his name is on an inscription that's from Egypt and Sinai. Isn't that amazing? Actually, from Sinai. Wow. How is that not connected with a biblical character? How many people in the Bible have this name? One. He's the guy. And then oddly enough, and folks, trust me, I didn't manipulate the evidence to make this the case. I never would do that. But of all things, Moses himself is named on an inscription. Sinai 361. All right, I'm going to skip all of this and because of our time is short, and just show you a little bit of these inscriptions. Here, this Sinai 376. This dates to about 1772 BC. We know the king, the Egyptian king who ruled, he has about a 3-year rule. It's 1775 to 1772, so it's right in that ballpark. That's when it dates to. And there it is, Sinai 376. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's at Wadi Nasib. Wadi Nasib is the water source, the place that was the water source that provided the water for those who would go down on these expeditions to extract turquoise in Sinai. If you know anything about Sinai, what characterizes Sinai? One word. Desert or dry, right? It's a God-forsaken place. And you need water to live. Now, Egypt, like many ancient cultures, had one particular food that was its main staple. Can you guess what that would be? Grain makes what? Bread. Bread and beer. Those are the two staples in Egypt, bread and beer. So you have to make bread. What do you need for bread? Grain that you bring with you plus water. Do you bring the water from Egypt? It's pretty heavy, isn't it? Yeah, you don't bring it. You get it there, locally. So Bir Nasib is the water source. So here's the inscription, published in 1961, I think it was, by a German scholar. And this represents, now I've drawn in black where the letters are, and in gray where there are kind of grooves dug into the stone that are false friends. And now I pull the photo away, and that's the inscription. It reads top to bottom in columns, right to left. And then finishes with this alphabetical letter. And there it is. It reads, the house of the vineyard of Osnath and its innermost room were engraved. They have come to life. And you see this word right here? De-v-r. Devir. Devir is the Hebrew word for an innermost room. It's used in the construction of the temple. For what room? Holy of Holies. That's the word, the devir. It's also used if a person has let's say, a 3-room house. The innermost room is your what room? Bedroom. Yeah, it's your bedroom. That's the same word, devir. That's the word that's used here. The same word that's used in 1 Kings 8 of the construction of the temple under Solomon. There it is. And they use the same word too for the verb here for engrave. The verb for kala. The engraving that took place, that's here as well as 1 Kings 8. You see the connection? The same concept, the same thoughts, the same words are all over the page, if you will, in these ancient inscriptions. So here's Osnath's name. That's an Aleph, Asnath, Osnath, right there. There it is, Osnath, the wife of Joseph. Then, that's Sinai 349. I'm going to skip through that just for time's sake and take you to, this is, So how many minutes left do I have? 4 minutes. So this is Sinai 361, okay? Consists of 2 parts. A main part here, and then a secondary part here. And if you see where I pointed the arrows, there are markings here, right? That show you could say, well, Dr. P, how do we know that this part is connected to this part? Well, number one, it fits pretty well, not perfectly, pretty well here. There's been some breakage, but there are actual common connecting lines of each to show that they're of the same inscription. And nobody really doubts this among scholars. So Sinai 361, I took all the time that took, lots of hours of work to figure out, what were the letters. Because before you even get to the whole part of translating, you have to identify every letter correctly. You want to make sure you've got it precise. And it means a lot of trial and error, recognizing your mistakes and going back and reworking. So after I did all of that, we now pull it away, and there's the inscription. Once again, reads top to bottom, first column, second column, third column, fourth column. And notice one thing, for those of you who are artistically inclined, notice this. I love this. Look at this column, the first one. It compares favorably to the third column. They're both long columns. Second column is very short, which compares favorably to the short column that ends here with the fourth column. There's symmetry. A plus B, if you want to structure that. So that's beautiful. Well, what do we have here? Right there, that letter there, that's a wave of water. Anybody know the Hebrew word for water? Mayim. It makes the what sound when you see the water? The M, the M sound when you see that. This, okay, and I have to go a little bit beyond PG-13 for this, but this letter here, and the Hebrews did it, I didn't, I just had to figure it out. Female breasts, a pair of female breasts. That's the letter for the Shemayim letter. Makes the what sound? Sh. So what does this give us? M and sh. They didn't write vowels, so you have to insert your own vowels. Can you figure out what word that would be? M and sh. Think of a Jewish person. Moshe. Moshe. That's Moshe. There's only one Moshe in the Bible. Did you know that? He's the one who led them out of Egypt. So here's the inscription, full translation. And remember the timing. This is right before the Exodus. Think of the final year before the Exodus itself. What's going on? Mayhem, right? Why? Plagues. Here's the inscription. Again, I didn't make this up, folks. Did not make it up. Our bound servitude had lingered. We are what? Slaves. It continued and continued and continued. Moshe, then provoked astonishment. And by the way, those of you who know Hebrew, this is really amazing. The word Moshe there, it's the first word in the sentence. That's not normal, is it? Because that's the subject. In Hebrew, we have VSO, verb, subject, object. That's the default pattern. If it goes out of the default pattern, what's put in the first position, it becomes the what position? A position of emphasis. It's the emphatic position, we would say as grammarians. It's the emphatic position. So you have to say it with a force. Moses then provoked astonishment. Isn't that beautiful? How did Moses provoke astonishment? 10 plagues. Big time stuff. Now, go back, if you've read scholarly commentaries, how long did they suggest that the plagues lasted? A day or two? What do most commentators say? How long? Didn't hear it yet. About a year. That's what scholars always write. It's about a year. Look at this. It is a year of astonishment. You catch that? It is a year of astonishment because of the lady. The lady, my time's about up, but the lady was a female deity, Hathor, connected with later Israelite history, Baal and Asherah, his wife deity, his consort. That's who this is, but it's the Egyptianized form, taking on the physical form of, it's bovine, so it's a cow, right? And that's why we get the golden calf. Why is the golden calf fashioned by Aaron? Because that was the main worship that the Israelites were engaged in Egypt. It's all over the place in these inscriptions. Her name, she's given credit for all these different things, including here. It is a year of astonishment on behalf of the lady, because of the lady. They give credit to a female goddess, the Israelites, rather than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is why the later prophets, in the later prophetical books, when God is speaking and he harkens back to the time they were in Egypt, he refers to them as idolaters in Egypt, doesn't he? Why? They were worshiping idols. And here it is on an inscription. Hebrew is the language behind the world's oldest alphabet. Thank you.